I shall move on to formally introduce Dr. Karina Croucher, who is a regular visitor to us, literally twice in 2 days for different purposes. She is now our external examiner on our PGT programs, and that's a great to have Dr. Croucher involved with us in that regard. But today she's back for the second time this year, though, because Karina was one of the discussants at our DigiDeath 6th University of Chester Archaeology Student Conference, but she's here again to talk about her primary research. So let me just quickly introduce Karina. Karina is an associate professor in the School of Archaeological and Forensic Sciences at the University of Bradford, and her research not only looks at the prehistory of the Middle East, but also at contemporary relationships between archaeology and attitudes, practices surrounding death, which is what she's going to talk about. So I don't really need to say much more about that. Her title has twisted a little bit, I think, but we had it down as Archaeology Contemporary Death, but she's going to be looking at the Continuing Bonds project and maybe a bit about Dying to Talk, but we'll see how that goes. But really, I just want to sort of shut up and pass over to Karina for her presentation. Thank you, Karina.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, Archaeology and Contemporary Death definitely works as a title still. It just might not match my slide, but there we go. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, that's fine. That's brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you.
It turns out with Teams, but it's hidden all of you. Oh, there you are. Okay, so the first thing to say is that you'll notice the many names on the slide, and that's partly because all of this research is incredibly collaborative. So it's all been made possible because of collaborations with people in different fields, including I've got bolded out Christina Full and Laura Green, and they're in Christina's a professor of palliative medicine and Laura is so they're both in end-of-life care, and Laura's also in nursing. So it's about that, thinking about how those different disciplines can add to our archaeology and take it to new audiences and think differently. But also everyone that's named here includes our placement students and different people that have worked on the projects throughout the last few years. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I'll talk about a bit about background, about the rationale, about why we want to talk about death, and then I'll talk about the Continuing Bonds project in itself, but then how that has also led to different understandings of the past, so how it's impacted on the archaeology, to then bringing us back to the present with talking about creative dissemination, Dying to Talk, and a Archaeology meets Psychology toolkit, and I'll end just finally with a tiny bit about archaeology, heritage and well-being. Just for normal quantifier, you probably don't need the warnings, but just to warn you, there will be images of archaeological human remains, and that we are unsurprisingly dealing with the topic of death and dying, which can be potentially sensitive topics. So just to give you a pre-warning about that. So in terms of background, so I come at this as a funerary archaeologist. I've always been interested in how people have treated their dead, but in recent years I was very much interested in how the past can give back to the present. So what more can this offer? How can it be relevant to contemporary communities? So the rationale behind this is the idea or the fact that more people are aware of their deaths, and there are sudden fewer deaths than there used to be. So bearing in mind this was pre-COVID, and yet despite so because of advances in medical science, because of improvements in treatments, it led to this scenario where there were fewer sudden deaths and more people were aware of the event before it was going to happen. And despite that, it can still be a really difficult and really challenging and really problematic topic, despite the fact that the World Health Organization, the NHS and others have kind of argued that we need to accept death as a natural part of a life course, rather than as some kind of failure in medical science. And the idea that talking about death can then enable better deaths, if we want to call it that. It can aid the family and the patient in preparing for what is essentially a really difficult time, but being able to talk about talk about the topic more freely, can build resilience, can aid well-being. And essentially, it's not just about being morbid. So you're like, okay, why do we want to talk about death? It's sad, right? Yes, death is can be incredibly sad, but it is a normal everyday part of life, and it's one thing that's going to happen to all of us. And I think enabling us to talk about death can actually free us up then to enjoy life and make the most of life and make us realise what we've got and value what we've got. So it's not all just about being sad and morbid. It's about freeing us up to appreciate life. So I began to think about, I'd noticed as an archaeologist, as a funerary archaeologist, the number of times when I'd started talking about my research, particularly some of the different ways people had treated the dead in the past, whether that's thinking about, I don't know, potential cannibalism at Domus Tepe, or treatment of plastered skulls from the Neolithic of Southwest Asia. And people would kind of be quite fascinated and be, oh, look, that's really different from what we do, isn't it? And that would then open them up to then talking about what we do today. And then very quickly, I find that people would start talking about their own experiences, fears, worries in a very quick, kind of natural way. So I kind of noted this. We had, and I was wondering then whether archaeology can be used as then a catalyst to prompt those conversations. So I was pondering this, and I met my colleague Laura Green when I started working at Bradford Uni. I went into the nursing department and said, I'm an archaeologist, does anyone want to talk to me about death? It went much better than I was ever expecting. And Laura persuaded me to go to the Palliative Care Congress. So you can imagine, as an archaeologist, going to a palliative care conference was daunting, to say the least. But I went to kind of test out the ground for thinking about funerary archaeology with new audiences. They liked what they saw. I got one of the few prizes I'd got in my life. I got one of their poster prizes about using archaeology to talk about death. And I noted at the conference that they were calling for, so one of the keynote papers said that we needed new and imaginative ways to encourage conversations about the dead. They said they wanted people to think outside of the box when it comes to conversations. And I was like, great, this is not only thinking outside the box, it's a totally different box. Also at that conference, one of those serendipitous moments, I was at a local bed and breakfast, just sat talking to this lovely lady at breakfast who seemed really interested in my ideas. She then turned out to be Christina Fall, a massive professor in palliative medicine. And I think if I'd known who she was, I might have been too scared to talk to her. But one of those kind of, when you're in a totally new discipline, you don't know who anyone is. It's quite liberating and freeing. So we hit it off. She was really interested in my ideas, and as a result we ran a test project in Leicester. It was soon after Richard III, and we ran first of all a continuing bonds event where we used the finding of Richard III to prompt people to talk about death and bereavement. And then with Sarah Tarlow, we ran the What Will Survive of Us project, where we got banners that included lots of archaeological and ethnographic materials, printed them out quite big, placed them in bars in and around Leicester, and kind of watched what happened. And yet, lo and behold, we noted that even on a Friday night, people would come and look at the Taj Mahal or plastered skulls and would very soon start talking about their own hopes, experiences, worries in a very speedy way, in a much quicker way than if we'd just gone up to them in a bar on a Friday night and said, do you want to talk about death? We'd have got a whole different reaction. So what we wanted to do was really provide an evidence base for this idea that archaeology can be used in this way. It was also inspired by the AHRC Crossing Over Network, run by the late David Kennedy, where we had a subgroup, Objects as Untold Stories, and we went into a local hospice. There was a team of us as an archaeologist, myself, sociology, English literature and creative writing, And we worked with hospice staff and volunteers, and we talked about archaeological objects and how us archaeologists understand materials and have thinking differently about grave goods. We then talked about what memories and meanings different objects can carry, whether that's as heirlooms or kind of objects that were precious to us because they belong to someone. And then the volunteers and workers brought in their own objects to talk about. We each talked about the different objects we brought in, and from that we created, with the help of our English literature specialists, a joint creative writing piece. We created a poem, a collaborative poem as a result of this. So again, a highly experimental project, but that was kind of one of the early inspirations for thinking about just the creative value in working with interdisciplinary teams that you'll see we've come back to later on as well. So from the conversations with Christina and Laura at the Palliative Care Congress, we put in funding for the Continuing Bonds project, which we're delighted was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And you can see here just how interdisciplinary the project was: end-of-life care, and archaeology, and Laura's also in nursing. And we had 2 postdocs on the project: Lindsay Booster, archaeologist, who many of you will be aware of, and Jenny Days, who is a psychologist. We also had Justine Rainsford from pharmacy join the project towards the end. So again, a truly interdisciplinary project. And we wanted to assess the impact of using archaeological case studies on discussing death, dying and bereavement. So are we onto something here? You know, we wanted to provide an evidence base for what we were observing. We were also interested in those interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary collaborations between archaeology and healthcare, and finding out about how that would work. So what did we actually do? So between 2016 and 2018, we ran a series of workshops across Bradford and Leicester, where we had health and social care professionals and students in small workshops. We showed them archaeological materials from that Lindsay had compiled from across the world, from through time, including some contemporary materials. There were mostly images on one side and text on the back that gave more explanation. They were designed to challenge assumptions and misconceptions and get people thinking outside of their kind of comfort zones. We did also use other media, so some videos. We had some tangible objects like replicas of grave goods or Griswold Man, and we were using these to kind of prompt discussion. We put people in small groups as they worked through different stations, each with different prompts. We got them to reflect on what they were thinking, what they were feeling, and then we had a big discussion at the end of each workshop that brought everything together. These were the different, we designed 8 workshops in the end, which were run multiple times in each city. These were the 8 themes. Each of these had different sub-themes within them, including age and circumstance of death, treatment of the body, images of the dead, objects in the dead. We tried to draw on archaeological themes as well, guided by myself and Lindsay, thinking about current concepts in personhood and identity and integrity of the body, for instance. And we so we show them the different archaeological, ethnographic and modern materials. The one thing that we tried to do to draw these materials together so there was some kind of cohesion was this idea of continuing bonds. So I'm just going to talk for a moment about what continuing bonds is. You've heard me say it a few times now and I haven't really explained it yet. So it derives from a development of bereavement theories. So it used to be the case that when someone died, you were encouraged to get over the bereavement, to disassociate from the previous attachments and form new attachments, very much inspired by Freud and Freudian attachment concepts, and the idea that you had to work through your grief. There was these linear stages that you worked through in a very linear way. 1990s, Class and colleagues and Tony Walter really began to challenge this and say, hey, look, that's not how grief, that's not how bereavement works. We don't just get over people, we don't just forget about them. Actually, what more often than not happens is that the dead continue to play a role in our lives. We continue to have these continuing bonds between the living and the dead, where the dead still have influence, still have a present, are still relevant to us, and that this is okay, this is important, this is a natural part of grief, and we shouldn't be trying to suppress that. And then Strobe and Schutz coined the dual process module, which really recognises that grief, rather than being a linear process, is ups and downs, and it's fluctuation. One day it's okay, one day it's not, 1 minute it's okay, 1 minute it's not. You get this fluctuation between acceptance and reluctance. So the idea of continuing bonds was kind of really poignant for us, and was an interesting one to explore past materials with as well. And I've just coined this, used this quote with permission from the What's Your Grief website, which I think sums up continuing bonds really nicely. It says, when your loved one dies, grief isn't about working through a linear process that ends with acceptance or a new life, where you have moved on or compartmentalised your loved one's memory. Rather, when a loved one dies, you slowly find ways to adjust and redefine your relationship with that person, allowing for a continued bond with that person that will endure in different ways and to varying degrees throughout your life. And this felt to us like a much more realistic expectation of what grief is often like. So we drew on case studies that drew on this idea of continuing bonds. And we were also getting people to very much think about materials that challenge what they think of as right or normal around treatment of the dead body, around funerary practices. So I've just got some of the materials that we used in our workshops now, just to give you an example. This is an example, a Torosian example, where the dead aren't seen to be properly dead until they leave the house, which can be some years later. You can see like this, that this lady has clearly been dead for some time. Up until she leaves the house, she's seen as sleeping. And our workshop participants really found this one a challenge. It was a kind of juxtaposition of still seeing a body on display with a mixture of a selfie culture with, you know, the phone and the thumbs up. This example was really challenging. This was an example of a ceramic set that an artist had created using 200 powdered bones in the glaze. And this really prompted people to kind of, they were like, oh, you know, how does that sit? What happens to the cup afterwards? How do I feel about drinking about something that's made of bone? But then we also talked about bone china, and or, you know, we know archaeologically that bone often gets used as a temper in pottery. So again, challenging the idea of the integrity of a body and how important that is. And then the bone ossuaries that we see across Europe, where the bones have been kind of aesthetically organised into these elaborate displays that include kind of chandeliers and you know, whole rooms full of these spectacular remains. And this kind of was really divisive for our workshop participants. Some of them thought it was very beautiful and loved the idea. Others found it really problematic and really challenging. They used words like disrespectful, that it was breaking up the dead body. But then it was also really interesting. We talked about the idea of the materials being designed to challenge what people thought of as normal. And we had one workshop participant, it was really interesting. She talked about how this example she found really disrespectful because it broke up the dead body, it broke up the integrity of a dead body. But then she talked about what she wanted, and she talked about wanting to be cremated and the ashes scattered. And then we were like, but isn't that also a similar thing with the body being, you know, broken up, the body's no longer integral? And she was like, oh, I've never really thought about it like that. So it's getting people to think of what we think of as right or normal surrounding our practices and how they're culturally contextual rather than universal. So although death is universal, our responses to it vary enormously, and there isn't a right or a normal way of doing things. It's all kind of culturally contextual. So just some of our key findings, and these were published last year in +1, where we gained feedback of the project. So in order to get our evaluation, we had a questionnaire that everyone did immediately before the workshop. We got them to do another questionnaire immediately afterwards. We then followed up with 1 to 3 months after taking part in a workshop to begin to see how the workshop experience might have influenced their own experiences. And then we followed up to 2 years later with a longitudinal survey, just trying to find out what impact, if any, the participations had. And we did find our results to be quite overwhelmingly positive, with people overwhelmingly agreeing that archaeological materials could be used to facilitate discussion in this way, and indeed that a workshop had made people think differently about death, dying and bereavement. All of our participants, aside from one, would have recommended it to a colleague, and that one person was forced to go by their line manager, which was a lesson as well, in that actually you needed willing participants. But again, the sample's too small to draw a conclusion on that based on that one person. So we were also thinking about why this worked, and we reflected on the fact that we'd created a safe environment in our workshops. We always had rules of engagement and confidentiality and non-judgment kind of built in. We gave them materials that created some kind of cognitive dissonance. So we used archaeology as a catalyst to challenge what people thought of as right or normal. And then we were able to share and examine their personal experiences in the group settings, which then appeared to impact on them thinking differently about death, dying and bereavement, which the participants felt was quite unique, thought-provoking, interesting, and essentially was personally valuable, and then essentially led to professional change as well. So this idea of kind of personal impact versus professional change is quite an interesting one too. When I started the project, I kind of had my thinking about impact, and I was like, oh, we need to really get to how the project changes people's professional practices. And it was only partway through the project, when talking to like Laura and Christina, that I kind of had a bit of a light bulb moment, and I realised that in order for any professional change to take place, there needed to be personal change first. And actually, if someone had a personal shift, that would eventually lead to changes in their professional practice. And as a result of that, I became a bit less concerned about trying to differentiate between personal and professional impacts and consequences, and just kind of sat back and kind of watched what happened. So that was me thinking about how the past has very much influenced the present. What I'm going to do now is think just for a few minutes about how then this research has influenced thinking about the past, and then I'll come back to the present again. So I've just got in here a link to an article I did on the plaster skulls, but I'm going to kind of briefly summarise here. And I know Lindsay's been working on this stuff as well, thinking about the Bronze Age. So before coming to the Continuing Bonds project, I was immersed in funerary archaeology, and one of the things I found most fascinating and most intriguing was the phenomena of plastered skulls. So these date to the Levant and northern Mesopotamia, mostly, some later examples in Anatolia, mostly from about 9,500 to about 8,500 BC, with some later examples in the later Neolithic, around about 5,500 BC. There's about 90 to 100 of these recovered to date, so they're not what was happening to everybody, but there are certainly a few of them. And it seems to be that what was happening is when some people died, not everyone, but when some people died, they were buried beneath the floor of a house. The floor was then covered over, people would carry on living in it, and then a little while later the dead would be returned to, and the skull, or more often than not, the crania would be removed. You can see in this example here that the mandible still remains in place, and the body is still fully articulated. It was just the cranium that was taken. And then these are found redeposited later on in clusters or in groups. You can see like different sets of them, and then some of them, again not all of them, but many of them would be sometimes the mandible would be recreated, and then they would be covered over with a face recreated out of mud lime or gypsum plaster. Sometimes quite kind of skillfully, sometimes with extra embellishment such as skulls for eyes, sometimes with painting. So you can see here these have got lateral stripes across the cranial vaults. Sometimes they'll be covered with a brown or a pink kind of hue over the face. And these are probably some of the most incredible examples from Tel Aswad, courtesy of Danielle Studer, where you can see not just amazing preservation, but incredible attention to detail. So here you've even got charcoal eyelashes that have been recreated. And you can see that they've got bases for to facilitate upright display. And this one has had its nose broken and rebroken. And you can see the reddish colour on this one here. So the traditional interpretations of plastered skulls were that these were about ritual leaders. These were about hierarchy or social status. These were the way of demonstrating elites. Or conversely, that they were communal events that would bring in the whole community as a way of masking inequalities. But these interpretations always come back to the idea of hierarchy and social status and where the material relates to the development of social hierarchies in the region. When we were first uncovered by Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s, they were seen to be wise old male and male ancestors. That theory was debunked by Michelle Bonaskowski when she CT scanned a lot of the skulls and realised that many of them belonged to children and women too. And Marion Benz has particularly focused on the age groups. We can also think about, those were the traditional interpretations, but can we also think about other motivations, such as relationships between the living and the dead, characteristics or abilities? This is a time with the advent of pottery or plastering. Could it be about people's skills with new materials or understandings of the landscape? But then I also, from working on the Continuing Bonds project, then had a bit of a light bulb moment, and I was like, I've been thinking about reading about the theories of grief and bereavement and thought, are we just missing something quite obvious here? Could these be about grief? Could these be about bereavement? Could these be about a desire to keep the dead tangibly close in a way that we see kind of throughout space and time, that we certainly see archaeologically? And we can see from the plastered skulls that they were displayed. We know that they were handled. They weren't kept pristine. They were broken. They were repaired. They were used. You can see them as being part of a household, but more often than not, they were recovered. More often than not, they were recovered from beneath household floors or in courtyards. This later example from Çatalhöyük is a male plastered skull cradled in the arms of an adult woman, but it was had multiple layers of plaster and had been used and worn prior to display. So these were used and handled. So I just wondered whether we're missing something here, and perhaps the plastered skulls, not saying that they might not have also related to elite status, but are we missing something here? Could this be about motivation to keep the dead close to the living, to keep them on display, to keep them nearby, and to maintain those bonds between the living and the dead? And what we see is that death then is not the end of an individual's role, but rather it's about a changed and an altered role. Like thinking about at Bradford, we've got in a School of Archaeological and Forensic Science. So the forensic side has prompted me to be thinking about whether we can try and tease this out a bit more. And this is still research that I'm kind of working on with colleagues, and in order to kind of determine the time frame between decomposition and skeletonization and retrieval of the skull. And it seems to me from a lot of reading on the literature that this actually could happen quite fairly quickly, quite a rapid time frame. So it wouldn't be beyond the realms of feasibility that the people plastering the skulls knew them and could remember them and memorialise them. But that's just work that's ongoing to try and think about this idea a bit more. Some further considerations. Does it matter whether the faces are the same during life or not? We don't know if they are at the moment. We need to do a big project to find that out. But also remembering that not all skulls were treated in the same way. We can think about the role of cranial modification, a practice that takes place at birth and seems to be apparent on a number of plastered skulls. A different talk for a different day. But we can think about kind of these emotive events, and I quite like Sarah Tarlow's classic work, where she says we don't need to be able to recognise the particular emotions to be able to identify emotive events in the past. I think that's certainly something we're seeing here with plastered skulls and with other areas. So that was me thinking about how the past informed the present, and then the present has informed my understandings of the past. I'm going to finish by just taking us back to the present again. So these are some further work we've been doing. This is a project with Mel Giles, which has just reminded me of something I meant to mention in one of my early slides, to say that actually the idea of death opening up, funerary archaeology opening up conversations, was very much being inspired by Howard Williams and Melanie Giles, who have both talked about the role of museums, bodies and museums facilitating this dialogue as well. And sorry, I meant to give you credit for that right at the beginning, Howard, so forgive me. But so in later work, we've also been, I mentioned that collaborative poem we did a few years ago, and that's always kind of stayed with me. And myself and Mel have worked on creative writing projects, Melanie Giles from Manchester Uni, around Whitworth Park in Manchester, kind of using creative writing and poetry to encourage school children to think differently about park spaces. So with the creative dissemination project, we took findings of the original Continuing Bonds project. So we took some of the statements that people had given us in their feedback and in their evaluation as a way of kind of demonstrating the variety of different reactions to death, of normalising talking about dead, along with the funerary archaeology. And we combined these into workshops for the general public in Bradford, Manchester and Sheffield, using these to prompt creative writing. So these were open to anyone. Many people didn't have experience of creative writing before, and we were inviting them to use the materials to both normalise talking about death, to build resilience, but also prompt creative writing. So we created an anthology, which you can download for free as a PDF on our website, and there are, I think, just out of the print copies at the moment. And we had some celebration events where people got to read their poetry out. And again, we got some kind of really powerful feedback from people taking part in that creative process, which I'll come to shortly. Another project I wanted to talk about is Dying to Talk. So this was taking some of the lessons of Continuing Bonds and working with young people, initially in Bradford for our pilot project, which was in 2018, 2019. And we'd had conversations with Bradford Bereavement Support and Child Bereavement UK locally that talked about the kind of lack of support for young people. So with Jane Booth, Ellen O'Brien, and now with Aoife Sutton and Mia Coe, we've been taking some of the Continuing Bonds lessons with young people, but doing it slightly differently. So, my co-I on this partner is Jane Booth at University of Wolverhampton. We had a pilot project in 2018 and 19, and we're just in the middle of a new Dying to Talk project at the moment. But we realised that, in people's experiences of bereavement, research shows that they often feel a certain powerlessness. They don't feel that they're given a voice. They often feel excluded from decisions and from deaths. They're often literally physically removed from death or from funerals. And we realised that starting conversations early in life can get people talking and feeling more comfortable about death and dying. In fact, people usually start out that way. It's just us repressing their conversations that is the problem. And that enabling them to talk about death and bereavement will hopefully build resilience and aid well-being. But we know from lots of devastating statistics about the high correlation between childhood bereavement and prison populations, children in care, drug taking and drug misuse, and crime rates. And there's, this really, really devastating pattern that seems to be triggered often by bereavement not being dealt with successfully. So we're trying to say that actually if we can encourage resilience in younger people, hopefully that will have a real impact in terms of life chances and reversing some of the inequalities here. So this is also a socio-economic factor as well. We know that you're much more likely to suffer from childhood bereavement if you're in lower socio-economic groups with poorer and with health inequalities. So trying to change that picture as well. The idea of equality, diversity and inclusivity is something that's kind of been an integral part of research throughout the years, and it's something I'm really passionate about, challenging some of those inequalities that we see. So in our pilot study, we co-produced resources with young people for young people to get them talking about death and bereavement. We created a video which you can download from a website there, and we had festivals of the dead, which were designed to get people involved in creative tasks. One thing I learned right from early on with that work from in the hospice was that people often open up when they're working on joint projects together, when they're crafting or when they're painting or when they're drawing. Something about that space, not having direct eye contact, being engaged on a different task can be really freeing to open up dialogue. So that was part of our motivation as well. So we got people doing quite fun activities, like just making your own Day of the Dead mask, designing your own coffin, making your own cremation tattoos. We used face paint. We didn't really we didn't really tattoo young people, just to prompt conversations. This worked really well, and we wanted to replicate it in our recent project. We want to help young people develop language to talk about death and develop the confidence, so that when these challenges happen in life, they feel better equipped to be able to discuss what's happening with them, rather than having to repress things, and to be able to support each other and create those peer support networks. We also are keen on this idea of a compassionate community, very much inspired by Ellen Keller here, and the idea that we needed to take compassion back to the community, including thinking about dealing with death and loss and dying, and recognising that these are community events and we should be there to support. So we want to build a model of a compassionate community for young people, and we want young people to be empowered to come up with their own solutions. So this is where we co-produced our resources with young people for young people. It was a challenge. We realised just how fundamental how embedded those power relationships are, and it's actually quite challenging to overcome those power dynamics when trying to work in co-production. So we're partway through the new project at the moment. We've got some festivals of the dead planned for next month, and then we've got a practitioner event again in December, with the idea then of informing the development of compassionate communities. So that's very much work that's ongoing. Here's some of the resources our current young people in Bradford and Wolverhampton have done. They've designed a children's book for talking about grief. They've created dance, they've created recipe books, a colouring book, and lots more. And then almost finally, I want to talk about a different project, the Continuing Bonds Toolkit. So this has been a collaboration between Archaeology and the Psychology Department, and discussions with Crew's Bereavement Care, and myself and Jenny Days ran a session at the Division of Counselling Psychology. about using continuing bonds with different audiences. So we had an interdisciplinary academic team, bereavement professionals, a web developer and service users as a team to think about how we can create a toolkit or a resource for use by psychologists and counsellors in supporting their patients, but also then something that patients or people that are bereaved could use. So we had this planned right before COVID, and then COVID hit, and we had planned this series of interactive face-to-face events where we replicated continuing bonds but with this new audience. None of that could happen. We decided to have a go at running some online workshops, and actually discovered they went much better than we were expecting. We found that people brought their own safe space with them. People felt comfortable in the setting, and so we decided to develop our resource, but to do it as an online toolkit instead. So that's in development at the moment. So we've got a toolkit which is almost ready for release, which talks about different types of grief, but it does it critically. So it says these are some of the ideas, but really this isn't about how grief works. Grief is individual and personal, and we've got ways to explore individual grief and ways to tasks and activities that people can do, such as a creative writing and others to help with the grieving process. So here's some kind of screenshots of what it will look like. In our kind of pilot studies so far, our psychologists and counsellors found that they were able to better empathise with their clients as a result, and that the materials and workshop did help to normalise talking about grief. So we're hoping to launch this. I should change autumn to winter. And then we're thinking about, obviously it's tweaking it, and then we'll think about taking it to different groups. We've already run a bit of a pilot workshop with one of our local funeral directors, and that went really well, so that's something we're wanting to explore more. So before I end, I just wanted to share with you some of the quotes that we've gathered as a result of a various continuing bonds project, which I think for me just really illustrate while we're doing this. So we've got, without a shadow of doubt, involvement in the project has been life-changing. This has been hugely influential on my life. So this is people reflecting on their personal experiences. Between the second and third workshop, a close friend of mine died. I think partly inspired by the workshop, I decided to write a poem myself to read at their funeral rather than select a published one. It was a very powerful and creative process to think about and grieve for my friend. So that one was a result of the creative writing workshops. And then last year and this year have been the first years in decades that I have not lived with profound grief. I attribute that to the workshops giving me the space to talk about my losses. So really powerful personal impacts. And then thinking about some of the professional impacts too. To examine relics from graves and other precious objects, to begin to understand how diverse cultures, ancient and modern, understood dying and death, leading me to question the cultures and subcultures I observe day to day in my bereavement work within families and communities in Bradford. I think that my involvement in this project has helped me to help others to articulate these aspects of loss. So this is a professional reflecting on how the workshop has taken and impacted their professional experience. One memorable conversation that was a product of the above project was with a patient who was herself facing imminent death. We had very little time, but we were able to talk about planning for her decline and how she and her husband would cope. So again, quite powerful. And then finally, looking back over the 3 years since I last attended the project, I think it definitely helped me to become more realistic about death for myself and for my patients. This project, I believe, helped to address our society's ambivalence towards death and often its inability to see it as something that happens to all of us. I think I became more confident in facing death and hence enjoying life. And I wanted to kind of end with that quote because it reinforces my point from the beginning about how this isn't just about thinking about death, but it is about embracing life and enjoying life and giving people freedom and permission to kind of appreciate what we've got. So just to finally summarise, so some of our underlying philosophy has been to challenge some of the status quos and inequalities, to think differently about material, being open to new and different approaches, to bring light to marginalised voices, including our young people, and to think about the relevance of archaeology and heritage today, its impact and engagement. And then also just to add that this work is having wider influence too. I'm just going to briefly tell you about some other avenues where we're kind of thinking about the role of archaeology and heritage with relation to well-being and resilience. So I'm also a co-investigator with my colleagues Adrian Evans, Owen Green and Andrew Wilson, another interdisciplinary project, this time with peace studies, where we've been using heritage and archaeology with, this is a building resilience through heritage project. We've been using them with refugee and host communities, so displaced communities in a refugee camp in Azraq in Jordan and the local town, thinking about the role that heritage can play in opening up some of those challenging conversations, in thinking about identity, but also ultimately in cohesion and well-being. So that's probably another talk for another day, but just to highlight how kind of the experiences from continuing bonds have led to a lot more confidence in thinking about this for new audiences and new ways forward for thinking about the role that archaeology and heritage can bring to well-being today. So what have I talked about? Just to conclude, the idea that archaeology can and does, and I'm preaching to the converted with you at Chester, but how it informs contemporary practice, about contemporary practice also informing our interpretations of the past, about moving beyond the dominance of some of our themes of interpretation, such as status, hierarchy and complexity. I've put in colonial here, thinking about the kind of decolonising aspects behind this too. And then thinking about archaeology for well-being, about building resilience, about tackling difficult topics. And then finally, just that collaboration is key to all of this, and none of this would have happened without my fantastic partners, postdocs, researchers and placement students that have worked on these throughout the years.